The bull stood in the center of the dusty show ring, a solid block of living mahogany under the high August sun. He was a yearling, but carried the weight and presence of a creature twice his age. His back was a straight, broad plank, his chest deep as a barrel, and his eyes, dark and placid, surveyed the murmuring crowd with a calm that bordered on disdain. Around the ring, men in clean shirts and sweat-stained hats leaned against the whitewashed rails, their faces a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. At the far end, Elspeth Dunn stood alone, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression as still as the bull's. She wore her plainest work dress, scrubbed clean, but still bearing the faint ghosts of mud and hay. She was not watching the bull. She was watching Mr. Sterling. Sterling, the owner of the vast Circle S ranch, the man who set the price of beef in 3 counties, stood with the judges, his thumbs hooked in his silver-buckled belt. He was smiling, but it was the tight, brittle smile of a man chewing on glass. His own entry, a fine-boned Hereford from a prized Texas line, stood in the corner of the ring, looking nervous and slight by comparison. The head judge, a man brought in from the state capitol, walked the perimeter of the bull one last time. He ran a hand down its flank, slapped its solid rump, and peered at its teeth. He straightened up, wiped his hands on a kerchief, and conferred with the other 2 judges in a low hum. The crowd went silent. Leo, the stable boy who had attached himself to Elspeth's homestead like a burr on a saddle blanket, gripped the rail so hard his knuckles were white stones. Elspeth felt, rather than saw, his tension. She did not move. She simply waited. The arithmetic was done. The work was finished. What happened now was merely the public announcement of a fact she had known in her bones for a year. The judge cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the hot, still air, "in my 20 years of judging stock, I have seen cattle bred for size, for meat, for temperament. I have seen animals that cost more than a town lot. But I have rarely seen a specimen that so perfectly embodies the future of ranching in a hard country." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Sterling's smile faltered. "This year's grand champion bull," the judge declared, his voice ringing with genuine conviction, "is entry number 7, owned by Miss Elspeth Dunn." A collective gasp went through the crowd, a sound like a single, giant wave breaking. He turned and said something sharp and low to the judge, who simply shook his head and pointed a thumb at the bull. The evidence was irrefutable. 2 years earlier, the only thing anyone awarded Elspeth Dunn was pity, and it was a currency she couldn't spend. It had been an auction day much like this one, hot and dusty, but her place had been in the cheap seats at the back of the stockyard, not the champion's ring. Widowed at 22 when a fever took her husband, and left with a small, hard-scrabble plot of land nobody wanted, she had become a subject of the town's mournful speculation. When the last of her husband's thin herd was sold off to pay his debts, she was left with an empty barn and the persistent advice of the town's matrons to sell the land and move in with a cousin in the city. Instead, she had taken the last of her egg money, $27 tied in a handkerchief, and gone to the auction. She sat through the bidding for prime stock, the swaggering calls for Sterling's yearlings, the quick, professional nods of the other ranchers. Then at the very end of the day, they brought it out. It was less a calf and more a rumor of one, a scrawny, mud-caked thing with ribs like a washboard and a cough that rattled its tiny frame. It was the runt of a failed lot, its mother having died on the trail. The auctioneer, tired and wanting his dinner, didn't even bother with a speech. "Want my bid for this sorry specimen," he sighed. The crowd chuckled. A man shouted, "2 bits for the hide." Another yelled, "I'll give you $1 to take it out back and shoot it." Sterling, passing by, didn't even glance at it. He was already talking about the price of corn. The auctioneer banged his gavel in frustration. "Do I have a bid or not? Last call before it goes to the dogs." In the ensuing silence, a clear, steady voice rose from the back. $25. A hush fell. Every head turned. Elspeth stood up, her face pale but determined. The auctioneer squinted. "Did you say $25, miss?" "I did," she said, her voice not wavering. A ripple of laughter went through the men. $25 for that. It was madness. It was a woman's sentimentality, a foolish waste of good money. The auctioneer, stunned but smelling a sale, banged the gavel fast. Sold to the young lady for $25. As she walked to the clerk's table to hand over her folded bills, she could hear the whispers behind her. That's Dunn's widow. Lost her mind. Might as well have set the money on fire. She paid the clerk, took the receipt, and walked to the pen where her new purchase stood shivering. It looked up at her with enormous, liquid brown eyes, a flicker of something not quite fear, but a deep, weary intelligence. She didn't see a worthless animal. She saw a flicker of defiance in its posture, a good, straight line to its back beneath the filth, and a deep-boned sturdiness that the fat, pampered calves in the main ring lacked. She untied the rope from the post, its frayed end rough in her palm. The calf took a hesitant step, then another, following her out of the stockyard and onto the dusty road home, a $25 joke that nobody else was in on. The walk home was a slow, dusty pilgrimage. The calf, too weak to be properly led, simply trotted behind her like a tired dog, its little hooves kicking up puffs of ochre dust. Every wagon that passed slowed, the driver staring first at Elspeth, then at the pathetic creature trailing her, a slow smile or a shake of the head the only comment needed. She ignored them. She was doing the arithmetic. $25 gone. That left her with $2.18 until she could sell more eggs. The calf would need milk replacer at the very least. That would be another $1. It would need a warm, dry place to recover. That was free, if you didn't count the labor of mucking out the long empty stall in the corner of the barn. Her land was poor, the pasture thin and baked by the sun. But there was a low-lying patch near the creek, full of willow and tough sedge grass that the other ranchers scorned. It wasn't good grazing for a pampered herd, but for one small, desperate creature, it might be enough. Her place was a small clapboard house and a sturdy barn, a testament to her late husband's hope rather than his success. The land rolled away in gentle, thirsty swells, the grass already turning the color of straw. As she led the calf into the barn, the scent of old hay and dust rising to meet them, a figure straightened up from the fence line. It was Mr. Sorensen, her neighbor to the east. He was a Dane, an old man with a face like a weathered map and hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. He farmed a small plot of land, even poorer than hers, yet his garden was always green, his single milk cow fat and content. He looked at the calf, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer pity. He simply watched it for a long moment, then looked at Elspeth. "They are laughing in town," he said. It was not a question. His voice was thick with the accent of his homeland. "I expect they are," Elspeth replied, her voice quiet. She found a bucket and began pumping water, the rhythmic clank and splash a comfort in the heavy silence. Mr. Sorensen leaned his elbows on the top rail of the fence. "Sterling bought the whole McAllister herd. Paid top dollar. Says the line is from Germany." "Very fancy." Elspeth said nothing. She carried the bucket to the stall and began to gently wash the caked mud from the calf's hide. Underneath, the coat was a deep, rich red, almost the color of wet clay. The animal flinched at first, then leaned into the warmth of the water, letting out a soft, rumbling sigh. "A thing is not worth what you pay for it," Mr. Sorensen said, more to himself than to her. "It is worth what it becomes." He watched her work, her movements economical and sure. He saw the way she checked the calf's gums, the way her hand rested on its neck, feeling for fever. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw. After a long silence, he nodded slowly. "A good line is not made in the auction ring, child," he said, his voice gentle. "It is made in the quiet pasture." Elspeth paused, a wet rag in her hand. She looked from the old man to the small, breathing creature in the straw. It was the first time in weeks that someone had spoken to her without a note of condescending pity in their voice. It was a lifeline. "I'm calling her Button," she said, surprising herself. "Because that's about all she's worth right now." Mr. Sorensen almost smiled. "A good name. Small things can hold much together." He pushed himself off the fence. "You will need milk. My Freya gives more than an old man needs." It was an offer of charity, but phrased as a statement of fact, a practical solution to a shared problem. It was an offer she could accept. "I would be grateful, Mr. Sorensen," she said. "I can pay in eggs. Eggs are good," he said, and ambled back toward his own property. Elspeth watched him go, then turned back to the calf. Button, she thought. The calf, clean now and shivering slightly, nudged her hand with its wet nose. For the first time since the funeral, the crushing weight of being one person alone lifted just a little. She had the calf, she had a neighbor, and she had the quiet pasture. It was not much, but it was a beginning. The arithmetic was still daunting, but for the first time, the answer did not feel like zero. The first weeks were a careful balancing act. Elspeth rose before the sun, her first chore to fetch the pail of warm, creamy milk Mr. Sorensen left for her on the fence post. She'd mix it with a bit of molasses and the expensive replacer she bought at the general store, ignoring the storekeeper's raised eyebrows. Button, as the calf came to be known, drank with a fierce, steady greed that belied her fragile appearance. Every drop was a victory, another small deposit in the bank of survival. After the feeding, Elspeth would do her own chores, tending the chickens, weeding the stubborn vegetable garden that was her main source of food, mending the endless list of things that needed mending on a small farm. In the afternoons, she would lead Button out to the scorned pasture by the creek, while the calf explored, nibbling tentatively at the willow shoots and tough grasses. Elspeth would work. She cleared brush. She dug out invasive thistles. She reinforced the fences. Day after day, the rhythm was the same: work, feed, worry, work again. The town's mockery faded from open laughter to a kind of chronic, head-shaking pity. "Still got that charity case?" a ranch hand would call out when she rode to town for supplies. She would just nod, her face serene. Being right, she was learning, is its own kind of reply, and it required no volume. Her stillness unnerved them more than any argument could have. By June, a change was evident. Button was no longer a scrawny collection of bones. The milk and the unusual forage had worked as slow magic. Her coat was thick and glossy, the color of a polished chestnut. Her frame, which had seemed so delicate, was filling out with a surprising solidity. She was still small for her age, but she moved with an easy grace, and her eyes held a calm, watchful intelligence that was almost human. It was this quality that first attracted the boy. Leo was about 12, one of those town boys who exist at the periphery, neither part of the rough ranch hand crowd nor the respectable merchant families. He was thin and quick, with a shock of unruly hair and a habit of watching things from a distance. He started appearing at the edge of Elspeth's property in the late afternoons, watching from behind a stand of cottonwoods as she worked with the calf. Elspeth noticed him but said nothing, a lesson she had learned from Wild Things. You do not startle them by looking directly. One afternoon, Button, with a curiosity that was becoming her signature trait, trotted right up to the cottonwoods and nudged the boy's hand with her nose. Leo froze, his eyes wide. Elspeth kept weeding her carrots. "Her name is Button," she said, not looking up. The boy jumped. "I know," he mumbled. "I heard the men talking. What do they say now?" Elspeth asked, her voice neutral. "They say you're wasting your time." "But she don't look wasted." He reached out a hesitant hand and stroked the calf's forehead. Button leaned into his touch, closing her eyes in contentment. From that day on, Leo was a fixture. He never announced his arrival or departure. He would simply appear as the afternoon light softened and start helping. He'd haul water, fork hay, or just keep Button company, talking to her in a low, constant murmur. He seemed to understand, without being told, that the animal was more than just livestock. He saw what Elspeth saw. "When she's a mama," Leo announced one day, holding out a handful of clover, "we should name her first calf Anchor, 'cause he'll hold the whole herd steady." Elspeth looked at the boy, his face alight with a seriousness that was both comical and deeply touching. She had been so focused on the daily arithmetic of survival. 1 bucket of milk, 2 handfuls of grain, 3 more days until the egg money came in, that she hadn't dared to think that far ahead. The idea of a herd, of a future, was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Leo's casual faith was infectious. Anchor, she repeated, testing the word. It's a strong name. And the next one, if it's a heifer, we'll call her Promise, he continued, his imagination taking flight. And the one after that, Keystone, he was naming not just a flock but a dynasty. He was building a kingdom in the dirt with words. Elspeth felt a laugh bubble up inside her, a genuine, unburdened sound she hadn't made in months. The boy looked at her, startled, then broke into a grin. In that moment, the farm was not just a place of solitary labor. It had the beginnings of a crew. Her and Leo and Mr. Sorensen. And Button, the ridiculous, beloved creature at the center of it all, who was growing stronger and sleeker with every passing day, a secret success story hidden in plain sight. By the time the first frost silvered the fields, Button was a yearling, and the whispers in town had changed their tune. The outright mockery had ceased, replaced by a confused and grudging silence. The heifer was no longer a joke. She was an anomaly. She had spent the summer in the creek bottom pasture, and instead of sickening on the rough forage, she had thrived. She was not large in the way Sterling's pampered Herefords were large, but she was deep-chested and solid, with the powerful hindquarters of a draft animal and a coat that shone like polished mahogany. There was a quiet dignity to her that was unsettling. Other cattle were nervous, flighty creatures. Button was serene. She would stand at the fence line and watch the goings-on of the world with her dark, intelligent eyes, and it was the humans who felt judged. Mr. Sterling himself had reined in his horse one afternoon, seeing the heifer standing near the road. Elspeth was mending fence nearby, and she watched him from the corner of her eye. He sat his saddle for a full minute, just staring. He took in her straight back, her placid demeanor, the surprising depth of her chest. Elspeth saw his eyes narrow, the look of a man doing calculations. Finally, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Still got that swamp dweller, I see, he called over, his voice thick with false heartiness. Seems to have survived. She's a hardy animal, Elspeth replied calmly, not missing a beat with her hammer. Oomph. Hardiness don't pay the bills. It's weight that counts at the stockyard, girl. Remember that. He spurred his horse and galloped off, but Elspeth had seen the flicker of unease in his eyes. He had dismissed the calf as worthless, but the heifer was something else, something his ledgers had no column for. She was an uncomfortable fact. Elspeth kept her success quiet, banking it like a coal under ash. She knew what she had, and she knew it was not yet time for the world to see it. That fall, she did the hardest arithmetic of her life. Breeding Button would cost money she did not have. The fee for a decent bull was astronomical. The local ranchers, protective of their bloodlines, were unlikely to service the infamous swamp dweller, even if she could afford it. Mr. Sorensen, seeing the worry etched on her face, gave her more advice. The best bull is not always the most expensive bull, he'd said, watching Button chew her cud. Look for the one that does the work. Look at the calves, not the pedigree papers, so she watched. She and Leo spent Saturdays watching the herds, not at the fancy ranches but on the smaller farms. They looked for calves that were sturdy, quick to their feet, with calm dispositions. They found their bull not on Sterling's ranch, but on a small homestead owned by a German immigrant named Schmidt. The bull himself was an ugly, bad-tempered beast, but his calves were uniformly excellent, healthy, fast-growing, and with their mother's gentle natures. Mr. Schmidt, a practical man, cared little for fame and charged a fair price. Elspeth sold every chicken she owned, borrowed $10 against future garden produce from the general store, and paid the fee. The act itself was quiet and private, but the waiting was a public trial. All through the long, cold winter, the farm felt like it was holding its breath. Elspeth worked, her hands raw from the cold, her mind a constant whir of calculations. Hay running low, grain prices rising. If the calf didn't come, or if it was weak, or if something happened to Button, it was a risk that could ruin her completely. Leo was her rock. He seemed to have no doubt at all. He talked to Button's swelling belly, telling the unborn calf all about its name and its future glory. "You be strong in there, Anchor," he'd murmur, his cheek pressed against the heifer's warm flank. We're all counting on you. Elspeth would listen, a small, tight knot of fear in her own stomach. She had staked everything, her money, her reputation, her last reserves of hope, on a $25 calf that everyone else had thrown away. She had followed her own quiet instinct against the loud, confident judgment of the entire world. Soon, she would find out if she was a visionary or just the biggest fool in the county. Spring arrived like a pardon. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the pastures greened almost overnight. Elspeth felt the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in months. And then, one cool April morning, she went to the barn and found Button lying in the clean straw, not alone. At her side, tucked into the curve of his mother's body, was a newborn calf. He was perfect. He was a deep, solid red, the color of his mother, with 4 white socks and a star on his forehead. He was already trying to struggle to his feet, his tiny frame infused with a vigor that astonished her. Elspeth sank to her knees in the straw, the relief so profound it felt like a physical blow. She ran a hand over the calf's wet coat, and he turned his head, his eyes, dark and impossibly wise, looking right at her. It had worked. Button licked her calf with low, rumbling moans, her usual placid nature transformed into a fierce, focused maternity. An hour later, Leo arrived, his face aglow. He had seen the empty pasture and known. He crept into the stall and just stared, his mouth open in a silent O of wonder. Anchor, he breathed, the word of prayer. He was, if possible, even more magnificent than they had dared to hope. He had his mother's sturdy bone structure and calm eyes, but the Schmidt bull had given him size and breadth. He was born strong. Mr. Sorensen came over that afternoon. He stood at the stall door for a long time, his old face unreadable. He looked at the cow, at the calf, and then at Elspeth. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "See," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "The quiet pasture. It remembers the truth. The news traveled through the valley with the speed of gossip. Heard that Dunn girl's cow finally dropped the calf. The tone was still skeptical, but it lacked the old mockery. It was tinged with curiosity. The calf, Anchor, grew with a speed that was almost unnatural. He didn't just grow, he flourished. By the time he was a month old, he was the size of a 3-month-old from any other herd. But it was his temperament that was the real miracle. While other calves were skittish and wild, Anchor was placid and fearless. He would follow Elspeth and Leo around the farmstead like a large, devoted dog. One afternoon, Mr. Sterling rode by again. This time he dismounted and leaned on the fence, making a show of casual interest. Anchor was in the pasture with his mother, a picture of robust health. "Decent-looking calf," Sterling conceded, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You got lucky. I don't believe in luck," Elspeth said, coiling a rope. "I believe in good stock." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "It's a fluke, a one-time thing. Tell you what, I'll do you a favor. I'll take him off your hands. Give you $100 for him. Save you the trouble and expense of raising him up." It was a classic Sterling move, an offer disguised as charity, designed to prey on her perceived weakness and ignorance. $100 was a paltry sum for a bull calf of this quality, and they both knew it. A year ago, she might have been intimidated. Now, she felt a cool, clear certainty. She looked from Sterling's smug face to the magnificent calf in the field. She thought of the $25, the buckets of milk, the worried nights, the boy's unwavering faith. She thought of Mr. Sorensen's words. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even and calm. "But he's not for sale for the second time." She had refused him. This time, it was not the quiet refusal of a grieving widow. It was the firm, confident decision of a stockwoman. And Sterling, for the first time, looked at her not as a foolish girl, but as a rival. That summer, the sky turned against them. It began in June, with a sky the color of a hot, brassy bowl and a sun that beat down with a personal malevolence. The usual thunderstorms that rolled through the valley in the afternoon simply vanished. Day after day, the heat built. The creek, which had run so full in the spring, shrank to a trickle, then a series of stagnant pools. then a cracked, muddy scar on the land. The pastures crisped and turned the color of dust. A profound and terrible silence fell over the valley as even the insects seemed to bake into submission. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The drought, which had been a worry, now became a crisis. The big ranchers, men like Sterling, were hit the hardest. Their prize-winning herds, bred for rich pasture and abundant water, began to suffer. The high-strung, expensive cattle milled at the dry water troughs, their sides heaving, their eyes wide with panic. They lost weight at an alarming rate, the flesh melting off their bones, leaving them gaunt and miserable. The price of hay, shipped in from greener counties, skyrocketed. A man's wealth was now measured in how many bales he had in his barn. The men who had laughed at Elspeth's $25 purchase were no longer laughing. Their days were a frantic scramble of hauling water, seeking out new forage, and watching their life's work wither on the vine. The feed store became a place of grim, whispered conversations. Men who had boasted of their pedigrees and profits now spoke in hushed tones of ruin. Pride, Elspeth observed, was a luxury crop that couldn't survive a drought. Hunger and thirst were the great levelers. She saw Sterling in town one day, his face a mask of strained fury. He was negotiating for a wagon load of hay, and the seller was naming a price that was nothing short of extortion. Sterling, who was used to setting prices, not submitting to them, argued, his voice tight with rage. In the end, he paid. He had no choice. Elspeth, watching from the doorway of the mercantile, felt a surprising lack of satisfaction. This was the man who had mocked her, belittled her, tried to cheat her. Yet seeing him humbled by a force as impersonal as the weather brought her no joy. His panic was the panic of every rancher in the valley. It was a fear she understood. Her own small farm was not immune. Her garden withered despite the endless buckets of water she hauled. Her chickens, stressed by the heat, stopped laying. The arithmetic of survival became brutal. But she had an advantage, one born of her initial poverty. Her land, with its scorned, marshy basin, still held a secret reserve of moisture deep beneath the surface. While the upland pastures were barren, her creek bottom was still tinged with green, and she had button and anchor. This was where the true miracle revealed itself. The fortune inversion, when it came, was not a sudden cataclysm, but a quiet, daily lesson in adaptation. While Sterling's Herefords stood dumbly in the baked fields, waiting for the hay that was their only known food, Button and Anchor went to work. They were browsers as much as grazers. They stripped the leaves from the willows, their mouths impervious to the bitter taste. They ate the tough sedge grass and the deep-rooted weeds that other cattle would starve before touching. They were not just surviving the drought. They were in their own calm, methodical way, thriving. Elspeth watched them, a growing sense of awe filling her. She hadn't just bought a calf. She had bought a different kind of wisdom, a genetic memory of hardship that the pampered, pedigreed bloodlines had lost. Button's ancestors had not come from the lush fields of England, but from some hard, forgotten place where only the adaptable survived. Her worthless bloodline was perfectly suited to a worthless landscape. It was a lesson written in flesh and bone, and soon, the whole valley would be forced to read it. The perception reversal began subtly. A neighbor, driving his skeletal herd to a distant, rumored patch of grass, would pass Elspeth's fence line and rein in his horse. He would stare, his face a study in disbelief. On his side of the fence, brown, cracked earth and desperate, lowing cattle. On her side, a sleek, deep-red cow and her magnificent calf, contentedly chewing on willow leaves as if it were the finest clover. The sight was so jarring, so contrary to the established order of things, that it took a moment to process. At first, the rumors were tinged with suspicion. She must have a secret spring. She must be a water witch. One man, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and envy, whispered that it was unnatural, that her animals were touched by something dark. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. But as the drought wore on, suspicion gave way to a desperate, grudging respect. Men began to stop by, not with taunts, but with hesitant questions. "What is it they're eating, Miss Dunn?" a rancher asked one day, his hat in his hands, his pride swallowed like a stone. Elspeth, who had been shown no mercy, could have turned him away. But that wasn't her way. "Mostly willow and sedge," she said simply. They seemed to like it. The rancher stared at his own herd, who wouldn't touch a willow branch if they were dying. "Mine won't," he said, his voice flat with defeat. They don't know how. It was then that Elspeth understood the true nature of her advantage. It wasn't just the land, it was the blood. Button and Anchor possessed an innate knowledge, a flexibility that the other cattle lacked. They were not just animals, they were a solution. The crisis revealed character, not just in the cattle, but in the men. Most, like the humbled rancher, were simply beaten down, their arrogance baked out of them by the relentless sun. But in Mr. Sterling, the hardship curdled his pride into a venomous resentment. Her success was a personal affront to him, a contradiction of the world as he knew it. If a lone woman with a $25 calf could thrive while his $1 million operation withered, then everything he built his identity on was a lie. He could not allow that. He began to work against her, not openly, but with the insidious poison of whispers and influence. He was on the county water board, and he began to agitate for a survey of her property, implying she was illegally diverting what was left of the creek. He spoke to the bank manager, suggesting that the loan she'd taken for the bull fee was a risky venture, that her collateral was unproven. He knew that a woman alone was vulnerable to such procedural attacks. It was a war of attrition, fought with paper and insinuation. The most dangerous attack came in the form of a letter from the county fair committee, of which Sterling was, of course, the chairman. It was a notice, coolly formal, stating that a complaint had been lodged regarding the parentage of her bull calf, Anchor. Without certified pedigree papers for the dam, Button, the calf might be ineligible to compete in the upcoming stock show. It was a bureaucratic knife aimed at the heart of her vindication. The fair was her chance to prove, once and for all, the value of her bloodline. To be denied that chance on a technicality fabricated by her rival was a cruelty she hadn't anticipated. She sat on her porch with the letter in her hand, the paper trembling slightly. One person alone. The phrase echoed in her mind. That was how he saw her. An easy target. Leo found her there, his usual cheerful demeanor gone. "It's not fair," he said, his voice choked with anger. "Everyone knows Anchor is the best bull." "Everyone, knowing isn't the same as proving, Leo," she said, her voice tired. "Especially when the judge is also your enemy." That evening, Mr. Sorensen came by. He read the letter, his lips a thin, hard line. He looked out the pasture where Anchor stood, a dark, solid shape in the twilight. "He is afraid," Sorensen said. "A man like Sterling, he is not afraid of failure. He is afraid of being wrong. It is a much deeper fear." He handed the letter back to her. "When a man builds his house on a lie, he will burn down the whole village to keep the truth from coming out." Elspeth looked at the old man, his face grim in the fading light. "What do I do?" "You do not fight him with paper," Sorensen said. "You fight him with a bull." The week before the fair, Sterling played his final card. He appeared at her gate one morning, not on his proud stallion, but in a dusty buggy, a lawyerly-looking man from the city at his side. He had shed his false hardiness and adopted a mask of grave concern. "Elspeth," he began, not even giving her a chance to speak. "We need to talk. The situation in the valley is dire. My herd is half its size. The bank is calling in notes all over the county. People are being ruined." He paused, letting the weight of the communal disaster settle. "Your success has been noted. This unique hardiness your animals possess, it's a valuable trait." "A very valuable trait," the lawyerly man nodded grimly. "A thing's only worth what others will pay," Sterling continued, quoting the old auction house wisdom back at her, but with a new, predatory gleam in his eye. "And right now, people would pay anything for a bull that produces calves that can survive this." He got to the point. He was forming a consortium, a new company to consolidate the valley's remaining stock and breed a new, hardier herd. It was a matter of civic survival, he claimed. and he wanted her to sell him Button and Anchor. Not for $100 this time. He named a figure that made her gasp. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing. It was enough to pay off the farm, to build a new house, to live in comfort for the rest of her life. It was a tempting devil's bargain. "This is a generous offer, Miss Dunn," the lawyer interjected smoothly, "particularly for uncertified stock. If you refuse, Mr. Sterling is prepared to formally contest the bull's eligibility at the fair, and I can assure you, the legal costs of proving provenance would be substantial." The threat was laid bare. Take the money and disappear, or be crushed. Elspeth looked at Sterling's face, at his cold, certain eyes. He had calculated everything: her poverty, her isolation, the legal and financial pressure he could bring to bear. He had done the arithmetic of power. But she had been doing her own arithmetic for 2 years. The math of survival. The math of patience. She knew the value of what she had, and it wasn't something that could be measured in dollars. It was measured in the trust of a boy, the wisdom of an old man, and the quiet, undeniable truth of a good animal. She thought of Leo naming the calves that weren't even born yet. She thought of Mr. Sorensen's simple gift of milk. She thought of Button's calm, steady presence. These were assets that did not appear on Sterling's ledger. "How did you know the bulls count?" she asked, her voice quiet. Sterling blinked. "The count. The number of calves you expect him to sire. The profit you've calculated. The figures you showed the bank. How did you know them without seeing my breeding book?" A flicker of panic in his eyes. He had overplayed his hand. In his arrogance, he had revealed that he had already been trading on her success, presenting it to his bankers and partners as his own future acquisition. He had counted her chickens before they were hatched, and he'd already sold the eggs. "That's neither here nor there," he blustered. "The offer stands no," she said. The word was not loud, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a slammed door. "The bull is not for sale, and he will be at the fair." Sterling's face went dark with fury. "You will regret this, girl. I will see you ruined." He climbed back into his buggy, and the two men departed in a cloud of angry dust. Elspeth stood at the gate, her heart hammering, but her resolve like iron. It was not just about a bull anymore. It was about a future, and she would not let him steal it. The day of the fair dawned hot and still, the air thick with dust and anticipation. The entire county, it seemed, had turned out, not just for the holiday, but for the showdown. The story of the widow's bull and the cattle baron's threat had become the stuff of local legend. It was a drama more compelling than any traveling show. Elspeth and Leo had walked Anchor to the fairground before dawn. The bull, unperturbed by the strange surroundings, moved with a slow, regal rhythm, his presence a calming antidote to Elspeth's frayed nerves. They settled him in his designated pen, and Leo immediately began fussing over him, brushing his already gleaming coat until it shone like wet silk. The moment of the judging arrived as a relief. The long walk to the ring, the murmur of the crowd, the smug confidence on Sterling's face. It all felt like a distant dream. Elspeth focused on the bull. Anchor stood in the center of the ring, a monument of placid strength. He was not just an animal. He was the physical manifestation of 2 years of her life, of her stubbornness, her quiet observation, her refusal to despair. And when the out-of-town judge, a man with no stake in local politics and a clear eye for quality, declared him grand champion, the victory was so pure and absolute it felt like a kind of grace. But the true climax of the story did not happen in the show ring. It happened afterwards in the quiet shade behind the cattle barns. The applause had died down. The silver cup was resting on a hay bale, already attracting flies. Sterling had stormed off, his public humiliation complete. And one by one, the other ranchers, the men who had mocked her, pitted her, and finally envied her, came to her. They did not come to congratulate her. They came as supplicants. Their faces were grim, their shoulders slumped. The grand champion title was a fine thing, but it wouldn't make it rain. Their herds were still starving. The drought was still a fact. A man named Abernathy, who had been one of the loudest laughers at the auction 2 years ago, was the first to speak. His voice was rough. "Miss Dunn," he began, crushing the brim of his hat in his hands. That bull, we've never seen anything like him. The way he holds his weight. We were wrong about you. About that calf. We were fools, another man nodded. We need that bloodline in the valley, ma'am. If we're to survive, they all looked at her, their faces a mixture of hope and shame. They were asking for breeding rights. This was the moment of her true power. She held the key to their survival. She could name any price. She could charge them a fortune, bleed them dry, and not a soul could blame her. She could take her revenge for every jeer, every whisper, every dismissive glance. She could make them pay for their pride and their foolishness. Leo, standing beside her, looked up, his eyes shining with a fierce, protective light. He expected her to be ruthless. Sterling would have been. Elspeth looked at their faces, at the desperation in their eyes. These were not evil men, just proud and mistaken ones. They were her neighbors. Their children went to the same one-room schoolhouse. Their worries were her worries. To exploit their desperation would be to become like Sterling. It would be to win the battle, but lose the war. She took a deep breath. The fee, she said, her voice clear and steady, will be $25, a stunned silence. Abernathy looked up, confused. Mom. $25, she repeated. That's what I paid for his mother. It seems a fair price. She looked around at the circle of astonished faces. And for anyone who can't pay in cash, I'll take the equivalent in hay. One good bale for every service. It was not a business proposition. It was an act of grace. It was the most radical and unexpected thing she could have done. In that moment, she did not just win their respect. She earned their loyalty. She was no longer one person alone against the town. She had bound the town to her, not with debt or fear, but with a generosity that shamed their past mockery and offered a path to a shared future. We all live here, she said simply. We'll get through this together. The years that followed the Great Drought were known in the valley as the Button Years. The name started as a joke, but it stuck, a testament to the quiet revolution that had taken place. Elspeth's generous terms meant that within 2 seasons, the Button bloodline was woven into nearly every herd in the county. The calves that were dropped that next spring were different. They were sturdy, deep-chested, and had their grandam's calm, intelligent eyes. When the summer heat came again, and the pastures grew thin, these new calves didn't panic. They browsed on the tough green shoots by the creeks. They kept their weight, and they thrived. The whole character of the valley's cattle began to shift, becoming hardier, more self-reliant, more suited to the land they actually lived on, not some imaginary perfect pasture. Elspeth's farm became the quiet center of this new prosperity. The single bale of hay from one neighbor, the mended fence from another, the sacks of potatoes from a third. These things piled up. Her barn, once empty, was now full. Her larder was stocked. The $25 fee, multiplied over dozens of services, gave her a security she had never dreamed of. She bought the adjacent plot of land, the one with the good well, when it came up for sale. She hired Leo, now a strapping young man of 16 with an uncanny eye for livestock, as her full-time foreman. He was no longer a boy hiding in the cottonwoods. He was a partner. Mr. Sterling's influence waned. His defeat at the fair had been a public blow, but Elspeth's subsequent generosity was the killing stroke. It highlighted his own selfishness and greed in a way no accusation ever could. He sold off most of his herd and his land piece by piece, his anger hardening into a bitter, isolated old age. He had understood the arithmetic of money, but had never learned the calculus of community. The second grand champion title came 3 years later, won by Anchor's first son, a bull named Keystone, just as Leo had prophesied. This time, there was no surprise. It was an expected confirmation. When the judge announced the winner, the whole crowd cheered as one, a proud, proprietary roar. It wasn't just Elspeth's bull anymore. It was theirs. One cool evening in autumn, Elspeth stood with Mr. Sorensen on the porch of her now-expanded farmhouse. The old man was frielier, his steps slower, but his eyes were as clear as ever. They looked out over the pasture, dotted with the dark, solid shapes of her herd. Button, the matriarch, now gray around the muzzle but still possessed of a serene dignity, stood watching her descendants with a watchful eye. The farm was quiet, prosperous, and secure. Elspeth had done more than survive. She had built something lasting. She had proven that value is not always visible, that strength can be quiet, and that the most scorned things can hold the seeds of salvation. Mr. Sorensen lit his pipe, the sweet smell of the tobacco mingling with the scent of curing hay. He puffed in silence for a long moment, watching the last light paint the clouds purple and gold. "The auction ring is a noisy place," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, full of loud men and big numbers. "It is easy to think the truth is made there." He gestured with his pipe stem toward the darkening pasture, toward the calm, breathing shapes of the cattle. "But the truth," he said, his pale eyes finding hers in the twilight, "the real truth is always made in the quiet pasture." Elspeth nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was true, and she had the receipts to prove it.